I had $4 million sitting in a trust account my daughter didn't know existed, and she looked me in the eye at her kitchen table and told me I was a burden. Not in those exact words. She never said it plainly. My daughter was always careful with language, the way people are when they want to be cruel, but still want to feel good about themselves afterward. What she said was that maybe it was time to think about my next chapter. That I had been living alone for too long. That the farmhouse in Prince Edward County was too much property for one person to manage. That she and her husband had been worried. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand when she said it, the way you squeeze the hand of someone you've already decided to put somewhere quiet. My name is Raymond Ashford. I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a surveyor for the Ontario government, mapping crown land across the north of this province, and before that I spent 7 years working summer contracts on pipeline corridors through Alberta and Saskatchewan. I know this land. I have walked more of it than most people in this country will ever see. I am not confused. I am not frail. And I am not a burden. But my daughter didn't know that when she sat across from me that October morning, with her husband beside her and a brochure on the table between us for a place called Willowgate Retirement Living in Belleville, she didn't know, because I had never told her the full picture of what her mother and I had built together. Miriam, my wife, died 3 years ago this past April. Pancreatic cancer. Very fast. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I stopped talking about money. I stopped talking about much of anything, if I'm being honest. I drove to the farmhouse, and I stayed there. I kept my accounts private. I kept my life private. And my daughter, Eleanor, had filled in the silence with her own assumptions. She assumed her father was a retired civil servant, with a modest pension and an old house that needed a new roof. She assumed I was just getting by. She was wrong. But I wasn't ready to correct her yet. I needed to see her first. I needed to see who she had become without the softening effect of her mother's presence. I saw her that October morning. The brochure had a photograph on the front of an elderly man sitting in a sunlit common room playing chess. He was smiling. He looked like he had made peace with disappearing. My son-in-law, whose name is Conrad, had dog-eared the pricing page. Willowgate started at $3,200 a month for a basic studio. He had circled the number in pen. Not highlighted it, circled it, the way you circle a price on a car you've already decided to buy before you take it for the test drive. Conrad is a man who mistakes confidence for intelligence. He sells commercial real estate in Kingston, and he speaks about square footage the way some men speak about scripture, as if the numbers themselves are holy. He married my daughter 11 years ago, and I was polite to him from the first day because Miriam loved Eleanor and Eleanor loved Conrad, and that was enough for me to work with. But Miriam was not here anymore, and without her, I had less patience for the performance. He told me the location was very convenient. He told me Eleanor could visit every second weekend, which sounded generous until I did the arithmetic and realized he was describing 26 visits a year. He told me the facility had a garden program. He said the word garden, the way people say it when they have never gardened, as if potting a geranium in a common room counts as the same thing as pulling a fence post out of frozen ground at 6 a.m. in March. I looked at the brochure. I looked at the circled number. I looked at my daughter, who was watching me with the careful attention of someone waiting for a parent to agree to something. I asked her if she was happy. She blinked. She said of course she was happy. What kind of question was that? I told her it was the only kind of question that mattered. I closed the brochure and I pushed it back across the table, and I told them both that I appreciated the thought, but I was not going anywhere. That the farm was my home, and I intended to stay in it, and that if they were worried about me, they were welcome to call more often. Conrad looked at Eleanor. It was a fast look, a look that had a whole conversation inside it. I had seen that look before on the faces of people who have already decided something and are now recalibrating around the obstacle. I drove home to the county. The maples along the Loyalist Parkway were the color of embers. I stopped at the farm gate and sat in the truck for a moment and looked at the fields Miriam and I had bought 30 years ago with the settlement for my first patent, 312 acres of mixed bush and cleared pasture, running down to the bay. We had never farmed it commercially. We just wanted the land. Miriam said owning land was the only honest kind of wealth. because land did not pretend to be something it wasn't. I thought about the look Conrad had given my daughter. I went inside and I called my lawyer. His name is Philip Garrett, and he's been handling my affairs since Miriam and I moved to the county in 1997. Philip is 72, semi-retired, and has the dry precision of a man who has spent 5 decades watching human nature behave badly around money. When I told him about the visit and the brochure and the circled number, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Well, Raymond, it sounds like it's beginning." I asked him what was beginning. He said the problem that always begins when someone gets old and has something worth taking. I told him I wanted to review the structure of the trust. I told him I wanted to make sure everything was airtight. He said he would have the documents ready by Thursday. 3 weeks after that conversation, my son-in-law submitted an inquiry to the Ontario government's Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. He filed a Form 1, a statutory declaration, asserting that a family member was incapable of managing property and personal care. He listed concerns. He listed that I had failed to maintain the property, citing a photograph of a broken section of fence on the north pasture that had been damaged by a fallen elm in August. He listed that I had missed a hydro bill, which was true because I had been in Winnipeg visiting an old colleague for 2 weeks, and the automatic payment had failed due to a bank error that was corrected within 48 hours. He listed that I was isolated and showing signs of diminished judgment. He did not ask me if I was all right. He filed a form. I found out about it because Philip has a contact at the OPGT's office who is not obligated to flag inquiries to family members, but is also not prohibited from mentioning them to the person's legal counsel. Philip called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me what Conrad had done. I sat in the kitchen with the phone in my hand for a long time after that call. The stove was on. I had been making a pot of chicken soup from the carcass of the bird I had roasted the night before, the way Miriam taught me, pulling the meat off the bones and saving it for later. The soup was starting to smell the way it should, the way it always smelled in this kitchen when she was alive. The window over the sink was fogged from the steam. I thought about what it meant that my daughter had let her husband do this. Not that she had done it herself, not that she had called me, not that she had driven out to the farm. She had let him file a form with the government to have her father declared incompetent without saying a word to me. She had sat across from me with that brochure and squeezed my hand and nodded along while her husband circled numbers. And then she had gone home and let him take it further. I did not call her. I did not drive to Kingston. I went back to the stove and I turned the heat down under the soup and I let it simmer. Philip began to build the response. He retained a geriatric psychiatrist in Toronto, a woman with 30 years of clinical experience, who examined me for 4 hours over 2 sessions and produced a 22-page report concluding that I was cognitively intact, emotionally competent, and fully capable of managing my own affairs. The report was thorough in the way that only documents written by people who genuinely enjoy being thorough can be. She noted my vocabulary, my recall, my orientation, my executive function. She noted that I had correctly identified the Prime Minister, the date, the Premier of Ontario, and the current interest rate on a 5-year fixed mortgage, which I knew because I had refinanced one of my commercial properties in September. Commercial properties. That is a phrase I had not used in front of my daughter in years. After Miriam died, I had let the maintenance of appearances lapse. I stopped talking about the portfolio because Miriam had always been the one who made money feel like a natural topic. Without her, it felt like showing off, and I have never been comfortable with showing off. My father was a millwright from Sudbury who worked with his hands and believed that a man who talked about money was either borrowing it or lying about it. I inherited that instinct. So my daughter grew up knowing we were comfortable. She did not grow up knowing the specifics. And the specifics, by the time Conrad filed his form, amounted to this: a trust administered by Philip on my behalf, funded by royalties from 3 land use optimization models I had developed during my surveying career, and licensed to 2 provincial governments and a national pipeline company, the original 312-acre farm property, now assessed at just over $2 million, 4 additional parcels of rural land in Hastings and Lennox, Addington counties, acquired over 20 years, a small commercial building on the main street of Picton that housed 4 tenants, and registered retirement savings account that I had been drawing down conservatively for 5 years. Not $4 million. By the time Philip ran the current numbers, it was closer to 6. I had not told Eleanor because it had not seemed necessary. She had a good job, a good husband, a house in Kingston that was nearly paid off. She did not need my money, and I did not see any reason to make her think about it, but I had also, without meaning to, let her believe a story about her father that was not true. I had let the silence fill in as poverty, and that silence had given Conrad the room he needed to build his case. He escalated in February. He retained a lawyer, a man who advertised on bus shelters in Kingston with a tagline about protecting family interests. And that lawyer sent a letter to Philip, asserting that Conrad and Eleanor were seeking an order for guardianship of property and personal care. The letter described me as a vulnerable adult. It described the farm as an asset at risk of mismanagement. It requested that I submit to a second psychiatric assessment conducted by a clinician of their choosing, and that I provide a full accounting of my financial affairs within 30 days. It was, in Philip's words, a money grab dressed in the language of concern. I read the letter sitting at the kitchen table where my daughter had shown me the Willowgate brochure 4 months earlier. The January issue of the Ontario Woodlot Association newsletter was on the table. I had been circling tree species I wanted to plant in the back section of the north pasture in spring. White oak, butternut, black cherry. Trees that would not reach their full canopy for 80 years. Trees I was planting because I intended for the land to outlast me, not because I was confused about the future. I put the letter down. I called Philip. I told him to respond. Philip did not just respond to the letter. He retained a forensic accountant from Ottawa to produce an independent audit of my assets and management practices. He subpoenaed 3 years of communications between Conrad and his real estate contacts, which revealed that Conrad had already approached a development company in Belleville about the farm property. The developer had responded with enthusiasm. There were emails discussing the potential for a 54-unit residential subdivision on the cleared pasture. There were emails discussing an exclusive listing agreement with Conrad's brokerage as the agent. Conrad had been shopping my farm before he had legal authority to touch it. Philip brought this to my attention on a Wednesday morning in March. I remember it was raining, the hard, cold rain that comes off Lake Ontario in early spring and feels personal. I sat in Philip's office in Picton with a cup of bad coffee going cold in my hand, and I read the emails. I read Conrad read into the developer that the asset would likely be available within 6 months, pending resolution of a family matter. I read him describing the property's development potential. I read him describing me. He called me a liability. Not a father-in-law, not a person, a liability with an asset attached. I looked at Philip. I asked him if Eleanor had seen these emails. Philip said he did not know. He said it was possible she knew everything, and it was possible she knew nothing, and that was the question I was going to have to sit with for a while. I sat with it. I thought about my daughter as a child, the way she used to follow me around the farm on Saturday mornings when she was 7 or 8, asking the name of every bird she saw, making me identify the tracks in the mud at the edge of the creek. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she had been, for most of her life, a person I was genuinely proud of. I thought about whether that person was the same one who had sat across from me with the brochure and the circled number, and said the words about my next chapter. I did not have an answer, but I had a plan. Philip filed the response to the guardianship application in April. It included the 22-page psychiatric report. It included the forensic audit. It included a full disclosure of my assets, which the court required, but which also had the effect of placing every number on record where Conrad and his lawyer would have to read it. It also included Philip's motion to compel production of all communications between Conrad and the Belleville developer, and it included a counter-application that I had been thinking about since February. I was not just defending against their claim, I was going on record with my own. The hearing was set for Thursday morning in June at the Superior Court of Justice in Belleville. It was a bright, still morning, the kind of morning the county produces in early summer that makes you understand why people choose to live here. I drove myself. I parked on the street. I walked into the courthouse in a charcoal suit I had bought in Ottawa years ago when I still attended government conferences, well-made, conservative, the suit of a man who has sat at many tables in his life and knows how they work. Philip was already inside. He met me in the hallway. Conrad and Eleanor arrived 10 minutes after I did. I watched them come through the doors. Conrad was wearing a new suit. Expensive. The kind of thing you buy when you want to look like you belong somewhere you've never been. Eleanor was beside him. She looked at me across the lobby, and for a moment her face did something complicated, something that might have been relief or might have been dread. And then Conrad put his hand on her back and steered her toward their lawyer. The hearing began. Conrad's lawyer presented their case. He described my isolation. He described the missed hydro payment. He described the broken fence. He presented a letter from a doctor, a walk-in clinic physician in Kingston who had seen me once 18 months ago for a flu, asserting that my age and circumstances warranted further evaluation. He spoke about the farm as if it were a problem to be solved, rather than a place where two people had built a life. He was halfway through his submissions when Philip stood up. Philip does not raise his voice. He has never needed to. He has a quality of stillness that courts respond to, the stillness of a man who has all the paper and knows it. He placed the forensic audit on the record. He placed the psychiatric report on the record. He placed the emails between Conrad and the Belleville developer on the record, and he read from them, clearly, for the court. The room changed. Conrad's lawyer asked for a recess. The judge denied it. The judge asked Conrad's lawyer to explain the communications with the developer. Conrad's lawyer said they were preliminary and exploratory and did not represent any commitment. The judge asked when the communications had begun. Conrad's lawyer checked his notes and said November. The guardianship application had been filed in January. The judge said nothing. The silence was its own sentence. Philip then addressed my counter-application. He explained, for the record, the full structure of my trust. He explained the nature of the royalties from the land use models. He placed before the court an affidavit from the pipeline company's legal department confirming the licensing agreements. He placed before the court a current valuation of the farm and the additional properties. He placed before the court the number, $6.3 million in confirmed assets, all properly managed, all properly documented, all belonging to a man who had been described in this proceeding as a vulnerable adult, incapable of managing his own affairs. I watched Conrad hear the number. I watched the color move through his face like weather. He had known I had the farm. He had assessed the farm. He had sent emails about the farm. But the full number, the royalties, the other properties, the other trust, he had not known. He had married into a family and drawn his own map of it, and the map was wrong. Eleanor put her hand over her mouth. Philip concluded by requesting that the court dismiss the guardianship application with costs, and that it note in the record the developer communications as evidence of the applicant's motivations. He requested that the court make a finding that the application had been brought without reasonable grounds and in bad faith. The judge took 30 minutes. When she returned, she granted all of Philip's requests. The guardianship application was dismissed. Costs were awarded against Conrad and Eleanor. The finding of bad faith was entered into the record. Conrad stood up and he tried to speak, and his lawyer put a hand on his arm and he sat back down. Eleanor did not stand. She sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at the table in front of her, and she did not look at me. I did not wait for them in the lobby. I walked out into the June morning and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and I breathed the air. Philip came out behind me. He shook my hand and told me it had gone as well as it could have. I thanked him. I told him to send his bill to the trust. I drove home to the farm. I changed out of the suit. I put on work clothes and I went out to the north pasture and I planted 3 white oak saplings I had been hardening off on the porch for 2 weeks. They were about 18 inches tall, each one. They will be 12 feet tall by the time they are 10 years old. They will outlive everyone who was in that courtroom today. I was washing my hands at the kitchen sink when Eleanor's car turned into the lane. She came alone. Conrad's car was not with her. She parked and she sat in the car for a few minutes before she got out. I watched her through the kitchen window. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands. I went to the door and I opened it before she knocked. She looked like she had been crying for some time. She looked, underneath that, like she had not slept well in months. She looked like my daughter, the one who used to follow me along the creek, asking about bird tracks. She looked like a person who had done something she could not fully undo and knew it. I did not invite her in right away. I stood in the doorway and I looked at her. She said she did not know about the developer. She said it in a voice that was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed a sentence enough times that it no longer sounds like language. She said Conrad had told her the guardianship application was protective, that it was to make sure I was taken care of. She said she had not known he had already been talking to developers. She said she was sorry. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I asked her the same question I had asked her in October. I asked her if she was happy. She started to cry properly then, the way adults cry when they have been holding it for too long. She shook her head. I stepped back from the door. I went to put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had shown me the Willowgate brochure, the same table where Miriam used to roll pastry on Sunday mornings, and I made tea. I did not say that I believed her completely about the developer. I did not say that I had forgiven her for the form Conrad had filed. I did not say any of the things that would have been easy to say. I just made the tea and set it in front of her and sat down across from her. The farm was quiet around us. Through the window I could see the north pasture, the new oak saplings, the late afternoon light running flat across the grass. The bay was visible at the far edge of the property, dark blue and still. I told her what her mother and I had built together. I told her the numbers. I told her about the royalties and the trust and the additional properties. I watched her face as I talked, the way the information rearranged something behind her eyes. I told her I had not hidden it to be secretive. I told her I had hidden it because I did not know who she had become after her mother died, and today I had found out. She was quiet when I finished. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She asked me what happened now. I told her that Conrad had a decision to make. I told her the finding of bad faith was on the court record and it was not going away. I told her that my trust was structured the way it was for a reason, and that the reason had just been demonstrated in a courtroom in Belleville, and that I intended to live on this farm for as long as I was able. And then the land would go to a conservation trust I had established with Philip 4 years ago to protect the shoreline in perpetuity. She looked at me when I said that, not at the mug, at me. She asked if there was anything left for her. I told her that depended entirely on her, not on the money. I told her that the money had never been the point. I told her the point was whether she could separate herself from the man who had filed a form with the Ontario government to have her father declared incompetent so he could sell his farm to a developer in Belleville. I told her that was a question only she could answer, and I was not going to answer it for her. She left before dark. She did not say what she was going to do. I did not ask her to. I walked the property after she left. I do this every evening, a habit from the years when we ran cattle on the back section, and I needed to check the fence lines before dark. I don't run cattle anymore, but I still walk. I went out to the north pasture, and I checked the oak saplings, firm in the ground, leaves catching the last of the light. Miriam had a phrase she used when things were hard. She said, "The land doesn't care about your feelings, but it will hold you anyway." She meant that the ground under your feet is indifferent to suffering, but that indifference is its own kind of comfort. It doesn't ask you to perform, it just holds you up. I stood in the north pasture for a while. The bay was turning silver in the last light. The maples at the edge of the property were fully out, dark green. The kind of green that only lasts 3 weeks in June before it deepens and becomes ordinary. I am not a vindictive man. I want to be clear about that. What I did in that courtroom was not revenge. It was a refusal. I refused to be managed. I refused to be filed away. I refused to be filed away. I refused to become the liability in someone else's ledger. I had built something real with my hands and my mind in 68 years of showing up, and I was not going to let it be taken from me by a man in an expensive suit who circled numbers in pen on a brochure and thought that meant he understood value. Real value is a field full of light at the end of a June evening. Real value is a 22-year-old oak tree you planted yourself. Real value is knowing exactly what you own and exactly who you are, even when the people around you are trying to convince you otherwise. I learned something about my daughter that year. I am still learning it. She called me 2 weeks after the hearing. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, about the farm, about a kingfisher she had seen at the bay the summer she was 12, about whether I was eating enough vegetables. She's called every week since. Conrad is apparently looking for a new position, one that does not involve my property or my county. I did not ask for details. I do not need them. I planted 12 more saplings in August. White oak, butternut, a row of black cherry along the fence line where the old elms used to stand before the disease took them. I planted them in the early morning before the heat came up, kneeling in the soil with my hands in the dirt, the way I have always done the things that matter. Slowly, without rushing, in the knowledge that the work will outlast me, and that is exactly the point. The land will hold. It always does. I keep thinking about those oak saplings, 18 inches tall when I put them in the ground, each one. I knelt in the mud of the north pasture the evening after the hearing, and planted them the same way I have always planted things that matter, slowly, without drama, with full knowledge that I would not live to see them reach their height. That is not a sad thought. That is the whole point. There is a kind of cause and effect that operates below the surface of things, quieter than courtroom arguments and legal filings, more patient than any scheme Conrad could have constructed. I have watched it work my whole life. A man who builds something real, brick by careful brick, over decades, produces something that cannot be undone in an afternoon, and a man who tries to take what he did not build will eventually have to account for that in some form or another, not through divine punishment, not through fate, but through the simple mechanics of reality catching up. Conrad sent emails about my farm before he had any legal right to it. Those emails existed. They were recoverable. They were read aloud in a courtroom. That is not luck. That is what happens when a person operates on the assumption that no one is paying attention. I was paying attention. I had always been paying attention. What I had failed to do was let the people who needed to know it. That is the part I sit with. Not what my daughter did, or what her husband tried to do, but what I allowed the silence to say on my behalf. I withheld the full picture of my life because I thought it was the modest thing to do, because my father had taught me that talking about money was either boasting or borrowing. But silence is not neutral. Silence gets filled. And Eleanor filled it with a story about a father who was managing on a small pension and needed to be managed in return. I handed her that story by not replacing it with the true one. That is on me. There is a difference between privacy and invisibility. I had confused them for years. Real integrity, the kind that actually holds up when someone files a form with the Ontario government trying to take your home, is not just about what you know yourself to be. It is about being known clearly enough by the people around you that they cannot construct a false version of you and act on it. I had let myself become invisible inside my own family, and invisible things can be moved around without much resistance. What saved me was not money. $6 million is meaningless if you do not have the clear-headedness to understand what is happening around you and the backbone to stand in a courtroom and say, "No, this is who I am, and here is the evidence." Philip could not have done what he did without my being able to walk into that room and demonstrate, in my own person, that I was exactly the man the psychiatric reports said I was. Capable, present, not confused. The capacity to think straight under pressure, to have documented everything, to have maintained the trust properly for 30 years. That is what actually won the case. The money was just what proved the stakes. I do not know yet what Eleanor and I are building now. She calls every week. We talk about the farm, about birds, about small things. She has not explained Conrad, and I have not asked. There is work being done in that silence too. Slow work. The kind that takes years to show. I am willing to do it. I am not willing to do it by pretending the hearing didn't happen, or by writing a check that makes everyone comfortable again. She has to choose who she is in relation to what happened. That is her work. Mine is to stay honest about what I saw, and to keep my door open anyway. The land holds. The oaks are growing. That is enough for now.